record and start going, and there we go. Okay, hello and welcome everybody to ASTROPILLED. We've got a little bit of a cozier audience this time around, but that's totally fine, because, you know, we can go as far as we want, or as deep as we want, as deep as our guest would like to go. I'm going to turn it over to Maybe to do intros, and she'll lead this session.
Yeah, today we have the Wilderless on, and it'll be really exciting to get into their background with astrology and what they're curious about and what their chart reflects about them. I'm Maybe Gray, and I am a baby lawyer by day, but a wooey witchy kind of person by night. And I've been really enjoying doing these chart readings with people who are kind of open-minded, but skeptical too about astrology, and just seeing what resonates and what people who aren't as familiar with the practices are curious about. So Salad, do you want to introduce yourself too?
Yeah, totally. Hey, y'all. I'm Salad, Saddle Sued, Sad, whatever, or Way is my real name. I am a software developer and architect who's been working in tech for about 9 or 10 years. And I've been studying astrology for about 3 and started as a total skeptic. Once I learned about it, I started, applying computation to it and starting to do analysis and finding some really interesting things, wandering down into the world of like financial astrology and trading and stocks and stuff like that. Yeah, that's me. And now I do this.
Yeah. Yeah, so the Wilderless, what is there a name that you prefer to go by, and what brings you to our little astrology podcast? What are your initial preconceptions about astrology, and what are you curious about?
Yeah, I tend to go by River around here. My real name just means river in another language, so we'll go with that. But yeah, I don't know much about astrology, and my relationship to astrology is mostly similar to like UFOs, basically, where I've looked at it, I've seen it, seems like there's like definitely a lot of stuff there, but that it will also take like years for me to actually sort out what is what. So I prefer to just let other people do that for me. So, yeah, I have no particular knowledge or relationship to astrology, minus that I like just went through my Saturn return and started like looking a lot about stuff for that. Although I feel like I hit a late one for that. Like, not a whole lot happened during the actual Saturn return, but right now my entire life has blown up, and I have to I have like the next 3 weeks to leave my home and leave this country and set up somewhere else. So that feels like more of a sleeper.
Yeah, and Saturn in the 9th, so that tracks perfectly. But we'll get into more of that later.
Yeah. Yeah, are there any like in a nutshell, like perceptions that are the most like prominent to you about astrology as it stands, or are there any like questions that mystify you in particular?
I saw Salad the other day posting about some degrees book that he's reading, and that one looked interesting.
Yeah, I can bust that out a little bit later. Yeah. I think we'll probably do like a general interpretation, and then I would love to bust some of that out, but please continue.
Down for it. And then, yeah, I was very curious about I don't know, I have a stellium somewhere. I have just like a cluster of planets in the 4th house, I think. I forget. But I had Witchuals from Twitter run me through that a couple weeks ago, so I feel like I've got an okay-ish handle on that now. But aside from that, anything, just tell me what you see. Yeah, I don't like know enough to ask good questions.
That's all good. We typically kind of start out by talking about the big 3 that show up in a person's chart. And so in astrology, these like 3 most prominent placements that feel fundamental are the sun, the moon, and the rising sign. And so, yeah, we have Salad indicating on our little graphic here for you if you're watching live. You're a little bit of an interesting mix in terms of these 3 placements. Your sun is in the second house, Cancer. And Cancer is actually ruled by the moon. So people who have a Cancer sun, to me, always have a little bit of this like solar lunar balance that I tend to envy. I'm very like solar. And so you're comfortable with your like day-to-day relationship with your emotions, and you're tied into like the way that you take care of yourself, the way that you take care of your close relationships, and you're not afraid of the parts of life that people call personal. You're a warm and nurturing kind of person. So that part of your life might come a little bit more easily to you. And then at the same time, your moon is in the fifth house in Libra, and that's like a much airier sign. So although like having a water sun in the second house makes me think that your day-to-day experience of your emotions might actually be pretty like strong and passionate and intense. The way that you express your emotional life might be a little bit more balanced. Libra is a very intellectual sign, and it's ruled by Venus. So it cares about like not just expressing oneself, but expressing oneself in a way that is aesthetic and in a way that's like fair-minded and balanced. It's not the kind of moon where I would anticipate that somebody would have a particularly quick tongue. I would imagine that you're able to talk easily with people who don't share some of your like epistemic background, and actually learn from people more so than other people might be able to. And then your rising sign is in Gemini, which is another air sign, so also like has a kind of intellectual bent. But this air sign is known for being like very flexible and very social. So I imagine that the first impression that you have on people is probably that you're very friendly and open-minded. But even though you have this like water sun that keeps you probably quite in touch with your emotional life, people might find that difficult to read on you if they don't know you well, because your rising and your moon signs are both airier and a little bit more intellectualized and detached. So I'm wondering if that kind of brief introduction resonates with you so far at all.
A lot of parts of it, yeah. That last thing you just said, where it might be more difficult for people to read certain stuff on me. That hits very, very close. People have a hard time reading me a lot, and I basically had to like, when I moved to Asia like 7 years ago, I had to change my entire personality to be much more like legible and upfront and readable to others. Because like it kind of works with my like native English speaker friends, because they can tell the tones that I'm using for things. But every other language, like people either just like immediately think I'm an asshole because they don't get that I'm like, yeah, I present myself as an asshole apparently. But yeah, so definitely hard to read for a lot of people up through the past couple years, especially the friendly and open-minded first impression thing. I have kind of just resting asshole face and like am very interior. So people do not find me friendly on first impression unless I'm like really putting work into it. But yeah. Anything else there that? Oh yeah, the one that like really slammed in was that I find it easier to talk to people with different epistemic backgrounds. Like I literally grew up in like a hardcore evangelical Christian cult, and all of my schooling was to be a pastor up till like 18.
Wow.
And by about 13 or 14, I figured out that I didn't believe in any of that and didn't want any of it. So I had to spend like all of my formative years basically like trying to translate everything that I thought and felt into like evangelical epistemics, basically. And like, how can I say this so that all of my friends and family will kind of sort of understand? And that's been a skill that's like definitely stuck with me. I'm definitely much more able to communicate across tribes than a lot of the people I know.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me that that would be a strength that you might associate with this Libra moon. It would be um, sort of instinctive to you to be able to perceive these like metaphorical bridges between different worldviews that help you to keep the peace in relationships that you have with people who are otherwise very different from you. Um, Salad, does anything in this chart jump out to you in particular?
Yeah, you have a very interesting chart, especially because I think you're only about a month or two older than me. So I recognize a lot of this chart. I know a lot of this chart. So it's interesting to me that you also have a very sort of like vocalized, friendly, outgoing sort of mannerism of speech. Like that's one of the first things you notice when you speak is that you have this booming voice, kind of very similar to me, because I also have a lot of Leo going on. But yours in particular is you have a Mercury in Leo, which will tend to make the expression very like warm, very friendly, very like relatable. It's all about like, you know, showering, kind of like glowing onto other people in a way that is often unconscious. It's almost like there's just an excitement around thinking, around speaking, like the act of, so Mercury, to back up, is a planet that rules your communication style. It rules how you process information. It rules how you learn. It rules all sorts of things mercurial. Communication being the big one, thinking, writing, dialogue, processing, etc. And in Leo, it will tend to mean that the way in which somebody with a Mercury Leo learns they'll need to be engaged creatively. They'll need to relate to the material in some way. They'll need to like, you know, imagine how it might fit into a grander scheme, especially of self, since it's in Leo. But the other interesting thing about your Mercury is that it's very close to your Jupiter as well. And your Jupiter is the planet that rules on one level an element of how you engage with faith, and on another level how you simply grow through the world and how you experience joy, and how you you know, like the moments and activities where you're like, oh, I'm alive right now, I feel really satisfied and fulfilled right now, perhaps even to an excess, is Jupiter. Like it's all about that expansiveness, that excess, that having it all. And you have it in Leo here right next to your Mercury. And when two planets are next to each other, that is called a conjunction. So they can get as exact as, you know, 0 degrees, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. Yours are about 2 degrees away, which is still quite close. And it's interesting that you've got a conjunction of Jupiter and Mercury and a conjunction of Mars and Venus, which are both 2 degrees away. But we'll get to Mars and Venus in a little bit. So the thing about this Mercury and Jupiter in the third house that's very interesting is that Jupiter can also represent, you know, how you find success in life. And so with Jupiter and Mercury right next to each other, it means that the ways in which success is often found for you personally is probably around speaking, writing, communicating, exchanging ideas, sharing, teaching, especially about yourself and about your world and where you come from and your background and sort of like the vitality of your own personal identity, because you have your Jupiter and your Mercury in Leo, which is the sign of self. It's who am I? Who do I come off as? How do I express myself? But then it's interesting that that's mixed into the third house, which is very much about, you know, communication, teaching others, writing. Yeah, like those are some of the big placements that I see pop up right there. And it's interesting because you've got these placements that are right kind of in a row, and normally those signs operate in very different ways. So it's interesting that your chart is so spread out very evenly, because it means that there's like a lot of different pieces of yourself that express themselves along different modalities and processes. Yeah, but how does that resonate for you?
Good, and I wish it didn't for a lot of it.
Really?
Well, just for parts of the, I don't know, like that success can be expressed largely through like speaking, writing, sharing ideas, teaching, etc. Excessively true, terribly true, and I'm constantly jealous of people who like are really able to pour themselves into like something lucrative and like that will make a life and a career for them.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, okay, I've got to find something to hack it out and make money while I write articles about shit and read young. Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, a Jupiter in Leo is a strong.
That one wasn't so much.
Yeah, I totally get what you mean. And it's interesting because, like, your Jupiter is actually opposing your midheaven. So it's kind of like something that is a little bit more dear for you and may take work to kind of like bring out into the world at large. Because, like, you can certainly have a huge success through writing, through, communication, teaching, sharing ideas, things like that. But it's interesting because, like, the third house can be very local. And with the fact that you've got your Jupiter there, right underneath and exactly opposite your midheaven, it's actually at one of the lowest points in your chart, which can also suggest that this may be one of the things that's most private for you, whether you mean it for it to be or not. But it's not, all bad, because like Jupiter itself is a pretty good planet to have in Leo, which is a money sign. So it does suggest that like overall, you'll probably do okay, like just long term in general throughout life. Like there's always ups and downs, right? But in terms of like general fortune, a Jupiter in Leo is pretty nice to have in a house that has to do with like how you communicate and how you share information. Because like that's also obviously a very big part of your chart. With your ascendant in Gemini, you're very much about like, that is very communicative. It's relative. It's about sharing ideas. It's about connecting ideas, especially. And then the Libra moon is also very intellectual. So it's nice to have the Jupiter placement there, even if you might be having some struggles right now, because it's geared in a place where it catalyzes the rest of the aspects of your personality. So like it's almost like these different parts of yourself that we've touched on are, especially your ascendant and moon, are very beneficial for your Jupiter. And you can even see that in the fact that by sign, there's a core compatibility component to the elements and the modalities of each sign. And so fire signs and air signs go well together. You have your moon and your ascendant in air signs, and they go well with your Jupiter Leo. But anyways, that's a lot, blah, blah, blah. I'll turn it over back to maybe.
Yeah, actually, I have a question for River. But before we go further, I'm curious, like, to what extent are you familiar with what the kind of most mainstream presentation of somebody who's a Cancer is like, and to what degree have you related to that in the past, if you've been aware of it at all?
What comes to mind immediately is something like a shell, very like self-protected and just like crying and emotional all the time. Yeah, does that hit any of the like pop stuff for it? I don't keep track of pop astrology very well.
Yeah, I feel like those are the two main elements.
Yeah. Yeah, the shell hits very, very well. I'm one of those people who just like keeps 4 or 5 like close friends and everyone else can kind of fuck off,
Mm-hmm.
Like I just don't have the energy for more than like sharing. Yeah, because it takes like a lot of effort to like open up and share with someone, and I'm just not going to do that for every person on the street. I just not. As far as like, I don't know, the emotional one is weird just because I've got like a whole bunch of, as I mentioned, grew up like hardcore evangelical and have a lot of trauma built around that community and not being able to speak or express anything in that community for a solid 20 years. So all of my emotions are just like pushed down very well, and like, so I don't feel a lot throughout a lot of most days. I've got a lot of dissociation and numbing going on. Mm-hmm. But when they do come out, it tends to be extremely strong and lingering. They stick around for a long time until they're like fully processed. Once they come out, like I can't
put it
push
back
them
in the
aside
box,
at all, which is probably why I shoved them down in the first place.
Yeah. I wonder too if you find that you're very protective of the few people that you do let past the shell layer and make like a close friendship with.
Yeah. Yeah, I put a big focus on those relationships.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I see. It's interesting to me that the parts of you that resonate most with your sun sign, I see reflected in the Mercury in Leo and Jupiter in Leo conjunction, and the Mars and Venus conjunction in the fourth house in Virgo. It's interesting that those two conjunctions straddle your IC, which is sort of the axis that has the most to do with like our private life and our roots and the traditions that impact the way that we're shaped. Because I hear like a lot of the protectiveness and the also kind of choosiness about like the value that you place on your close relationships in that Mars Venus conjunction in Virgo too. The Virgo characteristics that come to mind in this sign is that you value like an intellectual connection as well as like the more emotional and practical connections that you have with people. And you probably do have like high standards around the way that you spend your time and the way that you connect with people. Especially Venus in Virgo, I find has that like real, like it's like almost an aesthetic choice, not just a social choice, who is in like their inner circle. And I would imagine that both of these signs in Virgo, the planets in Virgo, would give you this like kind of flexibility that's very like service oriented. Like you, when you let somebody in, you like want to please them and have a really collaborative relationship, and that's something that I think is really probably very productive for you in those few relationships that you really like allow yourself to invest in. But I think that in general, letting people past like the shell of the crab is something that you find probably quite intimate, quite private, maybe even a little bit like risky. And when you do it, I think you're looking probably to incorporate somebody into like the foundation of your life. Like that's if that's somebody who's going to be a really close friend or a romantic partner in the long term, that they're somebody that you would look to like be really aligned with in terms of values. Does that resonate at all?
Yeah, quite a bit. Like, there's a lot going on in there. I'm not sure which part to respond to. But yeah, like when I find someone who is like clearly going to be one of those people, there's very much a process of like figuring out where they align like in the foundation of my life. Like, are they going to be here for a long time? Like, I need to kind of like build them into my life and like, yeah, protect them almost. Like, really include them in a lot of different dimensions of my life. And yeah, that has turned out very badly a couple times. So.
Yeah.
That's part of the complex part of that is like that is very naturally true for me, but I've had to learn to pull back on a lot of what you just said is stuff that like is very naturally true, but I've had to learn to like curtail it pretty well because stuff has gone real wrong a couple times.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I see that your Chiron is within 5 degrees of your sun in Cancer as well. And Chiron is a comet, which is associated with sort of the core wounds that we revisit and attempt to heal throughout our lives. And so to have that in this sign that's associated with like nurturance and home and connection and emotionality would definitely reflect to me that that's like a level of vulnerability that sometimes you've felt punished for opening up to, and I imagine that there will be sort of a it's a loose conjunction there. So I imagine that your identity will, in a lot of ways, be tied up in the way that you heal the wounds that you've kind of, accumulated around your emotionality over time.
Yeah, I think we got to talk about Saturn. Because it's interesting because, well, one, you're going through your Saturn return. And two, you also have a Saturn-Chiron opposition. It's a little bit wide. It's 5 degrees. And it's also out of a sign, which is interesting because it often will have a slightly different delineation depending on how you choose to interpret that out of signness. But overall, a Saturn opposition Chiron is often a story. Saturn gave birth to Chiron. And also, Saturn and Chiron don't have a great relationship with one another. Like, Chiron escaped Saturn, and then eventually ended up dying because he was stabbed by, I forget I think it was Heracles' poison arrow. But Chiron becomes this source of sort of like the unending pain that also serves as wisdom, because Chiron was immortal, so he couldn't actually die as a result of being shot by this arrow. And when we have this opposition from Saturn, it's very interesting to hear you describe your upbringing, because it does seem very Cancerian, kind of like this evangelical, cloistered experience that is very much the home. You're literally locked in there. You're forced to be there. And to throw in a little bit of degree theory, it's interesting that your sun is here with Chiron. And what I've recently learned about degree theory, and this is new on the show, this is from Nikolai Stoyanovic's book, The Secrets of Exact Astrology, or the Degree System or Theory. And he has a very interesting methodology where he assigns each single degree to be associated to the nature of a sign. But he also has various different types of delineations for those degrees specifically. So like the 24th degree, it's very interesting because the 24th degree is a Pisces degree. The way it works is you start with the 0th degree being kind of like the super degree of that sign. So like 0 Cancer is super Cancer, but then you start at 1 Aries, 2 Taurus, 3 Gemini, and you go up until it loops. And then what is interesting is that if you go from 25 to 29, it actually just goes from Aries to Leo and then switches back over to Aries, and then whatever first 0th degree there is next, and then Aries again. So it's a little bit of a strange and interesting theory, but let me just pull this up instead of talking about it so we can actually look. But one of the things I was thinking about is, while looking at your chart, is that the 24th degree, and I actually have a prominent placement that's in the 24th degree. My ascendant, and the 24th degree has to do essentially as being a Pisces sign with escape, with loss, with fear, with being invisible, with isolated places, with monasteries, sanctuaries of religious and divine nature, a church, an icon, divine, Eden, heavenly, God, contact with God, night, error, abysses, chasms, photography. This one hit me because false, insincere, counterfeit, to forge, pseudonym, false representation, and I'm the person with the freaking like auto-changing, glitchy avatar, vague, foggy, obscure, research, laboratory, science, doctorate degree, C, Godfather, flight to run away, to escape. And it's very interesting that clearly what must have been a pivotal experience growing up was the experience of, being in this cloistered, very like sacred evangelical environment. And it's interesting also that it's very close to your Chiron in 29 degrees, because Chiron is, the source of our pain. It sounds like you went through a lot, and that there's still very much to unpack there for you personally. So when we look at the Saturn opposition, the Saturn is really what activates your Chiron here, because the Saturn opposition is kind of like that constant cold pressure to not let it out. Like Saturn versus Chiron is like, get it together, boy. Like, don't cry, don't do anything, like fucking hold it together. Otherwise, something bad's going to happen. Like you're going to get disciplined or punished or admonished or what have you. So that Saturn there is pretty strong, but it's also something that has given you stability through life. These crucible-like experiences have helped you form a stronger sort of like emotional nature as a result, because, and we can see that, not because, but we can see that correlated by the trine from Saturn to your moon here, which is your emotional nature. So we could say, while you have this very tough dynamic here that's happening, at the same time, that pressure and that sort of crucible of an experience becomes an area of strength for you personally going through life, especially as it is pretty high in the sky. So it's an important placement, and it's very close to your midheaven. So it also implies like, a fairly diligent career that involves like a lot of hard work, that where you really have to work at it for your success, but you earn that for yourself. It's detached from the other experiences of your life. Like you have made that for yourself. And I think that's also important when we consider the changeover from Cancer to Leo. Cancer is all about the home. It's about the family. It's about the community. It's about the people you're around and the people you are obligated towards. Whereas Leo is the sign of you. It is your personal experience, your personal quest, your personal mission. And your sun of like the identity of the things that forged you and where you come from is in Cancer. But then your Jupiter, which is where you thrive personally, is in Leo. So there's a pretty interesting story that's being told here for you about this past experience you've had and what that means in terms of what you're bringing into this life now. And I'll tell you that the 9th house, Saturn, is also like, it is a stereotype that you move internationally when you have your Saturn return. Like it is literally like, that's the definition. Like 9th house is foreign cultures, foreign places, other countries, also institutions like academia, higher knowledge, things like that, sometimes government. And so when you have a Saturn there, it often implies that like you'll either work for those reasons, or, often you'll have to move for those reasons for work, or you'll just have like a constant source of like stuff that happens in that 9th house department where you kind of have to like deal with the outcomes or deal with, it's often work for most people, but sometimes Saturn could also just bring general obligations to the house it's in. That was a lot. How does that resonate?
I mean, yeah, that last bit's hilarious just because, like, the Vietnam government is forcing me to move countries, essentially. Wow. So I've got government and moving right there.
And Saturn, too. Like, authorities, you don't have a choice. Like, absolutely.
Yep, they're very much just like, foreigners, get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
Go.
Wow.
Oh, well. Anyone know anything about Albania? I'm hoping it's going to be done.
I don't, but, unfortunately.
As far as... I'll figure it out, I'm sure. Yeah, the earlier stuff, you mentioned stability, like a strong sense of stability, and yeah, I've very much always been kind of the anchor of my friend groups and the people in my life. Like, yeah, I'm very much like the stable person that you can come to and have everything get like toned down and put in perspective and stuff. So that definitely hits. The monastery thing at the beginning was amusing because my whole early 20s was basically me like, I read somewhere that like most monasteries these days won't take you like if you have a certain amount of debt. And I was like, okay, I've got to pay off my student loans so I can go join a monastery. And that was like my goal. And like, that's why I'm in Vietnam in the first place, was this was the place where I could save the most money and live on the least money so that I could just throw everything at my student loans, get it done, and just go to a monastery, and that was it. And then I got really big into the whole tantric sutric divide, and was like, oh, monasteries ain't for me. That seems like a not great decision for me. So now I'm stuck with no debt now. It's not the American way.
Yeah, that's not where you wanted to end up at all.
Right. Although, yeah, moving both of my cats and me and my partner to Albania, I will probably get to taste that sweet, sweet American debt soon again.
Finally, feels like home.
Exactly. And yeah, just what you mentioned with like having, for the 28th degree thing, like having 3 or 4 different names and constantly changing pictures and stuff, like, just because of the nature of my work, I go by like 3 or 4 different names here. My partner goes by 2 or 3 different names. And yeah, so I've got like my real name, and then on Twitter and all the people in this general Dharma Twitter area. I just go by River. And then I have another name for like a separate business of placing teachers around Vietnam, basically. Oh yeah, and then I used to go by a totally separate name. But yeah, I actually just did a thread about this on Twitter a couple days ago, how like everywhere I go in my life, it seems like I'm just surrounded by people who have like 3, 4, 5 different names that are all kind of like churning around in them. So yeah, that's interesting.
That is really interesting.
But yeah, all of that seemed very on point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've like 2 or 3 times dated girls without like knowing their full name for the first like 3 or 4 months and not knowing that I didn't know their full name.
Oh, wow.
Just come out one day just like, oh, by the way, my birth name is Choi and Young. And I'm like, then what is Geo? I don't understand. Oh, no, I just picked that name a few months ago.
Oh, a few months ago. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll kick it back.
It's really funny to hear that you like were pursuing this like structure where you could like undergo some sort of a discipline, and you had to pay off all your debts because your north node, which is sort of like something that reflects the life path that you are on as an individual, is in Capricorn in the 8th house. And Capricorn is like ruled by Saturn, all about disciplines and embracing limitations. And then the 8th house is all about like one of the big themes of the 8th house is debts, so that you would like be in pursuit of both discipline, and that would bring up a need to reconcile your debts. Feels like a very 8th house Capricorn North Node thing to experience.
Nice.
Yeah, and I definitely describe, following a tantric path over one that's more monasterial. Is, I guess it's sutric, right? Is the opposite of tantric. So that is definitely an 8th house quality as well, if you ask me, because like 8th house is all about it's the intense house. It's the house of death and taxes, but also debts, sex, regeneration, creation through destruction. It's very kind of like all the dark underbellies of the human psyche and soul and consciousness, pulling that out. And so the North Node there is probably part of what's also calling you there, but you also have your Neptune there and your Uranus, which can suggest a fascination, that's Uranus, with 8th house topics, and just a natural spiritual draw to it with your Neptune there as well. So I think, you're living your chart. That's a great fit.
Yep.
Is there anything that having like heard some of the things that stand out to us about your chart, you are like curious about, or wonder what like reasoning we put behind it, or what attracts us to looking at people through this sort of a lens? I'm just curious if there's anything that you want to know.
Gotta be perfectly honest here. The past like couple weeks, my entire brain is just like a fragmented, twisting. The image I get is like the space junk that rotates around Earth, just kind of flipping every which way.
Yeah.
Like I've got logistics of moving cats through 2 and 3 different countries and airports during COVID, and everything else about getting Vietnam in my head. So nothing is really like sticking. As like, oh, this, I need to ask about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I would probably like, if I listen to this again in 3 or 4 weeks, there will almost definitely be something that just like comes up, and I'm like, oh shit, I need to message them and ask about this. But right now, like, I just don't have it in my brain.
Yeah, no worries.
Like, a question sticking.
I'm very curious. Maybe, do you have any opinions about that 6th house Pluto?
I think that, the Pluto in Scorpio means that it's in its domicile, so I would imagine that the like long-term transformations that you undergo in your life will probably be pretty like deep, and Yeah, like you might feel like you're able to pick them out, at least in retrospect, even if they're a little bit slow to develop. I also think it's really interesting that it's like right by the descendant. I wonder if there's like, this is just like a thing I've been thinking about, but I wonder if people with like Uranus or Pluto or planets associated with change near the descendant like to appear consistent. And that's just something that I've like guessed at in the last little while based on charts that I've been reading. But I wonder if there's anything about it that stands out to you in particular.
Yeah, so it's interesting because like Pluto here is in the sixth house is a more, it's a less common thing that I'm aware of with Pluto personally. Like I don't see this one a lot. But it can suggest, so Pluto is a planet of deep transformation. It's a planet of, it really does have an affinity with the eighth house. It often has to do with these intense transformative experiences. It is also often the location where we experience certain types of obsession or even a compulsive drive to control something or to hold on to something or to dominate something, whether that's ourselves or, a part of our life, most typically. And here it's actually creating a T-square aspect pattern between your Jupiter and your midheaven, which is a very interesting story because your Jupiter is kind of like the core of, your personal success, and where you find personal fulfillment, whereas your midheaven is a point that's more about how the world sees you and what you're known for putting out into the world. And being in Aquarius, it's often going to be something that is highly intellectual, that's very new and futuristic and different and more for the people. It can sometimes be a little utopian, but it's often like has this very like open-minded, future-facing Aquarian nature to it. So like that's kind of like the style of thing that your work will be known for. It doesn't necessarily describe it, but it's often where it will fit into the world and the minds of the people that see it. Excuse me. You also have, with this opposition, you have a Pluto in the sixth house. And when two planets or placements are in opposition, they often just go back and forth. Like it's kind of like you can't fulfill both things at once. You have to do one, then you do the other, then you do the other. But when you have a T-square, it means that there's kind of an outlet between that opposition to go into the route of the square. And so your Jupiter and your midheaven are both squaring your Pluto. And so that suggests that when you're struggling with the relationship of what do I make for myself versus what do I make for the world, that can somehow be resolved by going to the sixth house and your Pluto there. And the sixth house has to do with routines, with personal health, with your habits. It's kind of the realm of like material realism. It has affinity with Virgo, and you could view it as having to do with like not having enough time, or how do you manage your energy? How do you manage your body? How do you manage your schedule? How do you fit like so much material stuff into a physical space? How do you fit so much activities into a limited span of time? It can also have to do with like your literal work and your job, and also sometimes your employees or people who report to you. And Pluto there will tend to make those topics be a realm of almost like very particular focus, sometimes obsession, because that's one of the natures of Pluto. So I'm curious to hear how you relate to kind of like what I described around the sixth house.
There was a lot in there that I just is like pissing me off because it's like everything I've been struggling with the past like couple months here with everything going on. My answer is going to be a little bit impressionistic just because I don't have the brain power to like organize it into a whole thing.
Heck yeah, please do.
And yes, immediately I already have like written on a note over here, like re-listen to the part about 45 minutes in. I need to re-listen to everything you just said later. Yeah, first off, with what you just said about the opposition and then the squaring, like finding an outlet between that opposition versus like going back and forth on it. My whole past like week, I've been doing a lot of Jung research the past several months and or several years, I guess. But the past few days has been like really digging deep into the transcendent function. Any familiarity with the transcendent function in Jungian psych?
Lay it on us.
Okay, it's really connected to like opposites are his core thing. Everything is opposites with that dude. And the transcendent function is kind of the way to like not just go back and forth between opposites, but where like they fight each other to the point where it's so much energy wells up that it like has to break through into another path that includes both of them, basically, or that is a third path that both of them can be channeled into, essentially. And the opposition you were describing, a lot of what you were saying about Pluto with deep transformation and like weaving a bunch of things together in a new or utopian type of fashion, and then what may be said about like slow change over time that might not be noticed very well. The main thing that I've been working on lately is trying to like synthesize a few different techniques that are like all focused on starting from like very deep interior transformation and letting that like grow out from the inside rather than trying to like change things from the outside in, like paste on new behaviors, new habits, etc., etc. I've been trying to like push away from that and tie more like immunity to change work, complexes, archetype, shadow work, various types of image work, essentially, into like deep interior slowly working its way to the outside and tying like the transcendent function with like its opposite channeling, tying it all under that umbrella. And as I've been working on that, I have also been having to figure out a whole bunch of visa stuff and a whole bunch of transit stuff and a whole bunch of where does the money for all of the visas and transit and moving come in.
Yeah.
So like kind of the busy organizing everything, can't find enough time for everything. Just the very flurried activity sense of it.
Yeah, it's so interesting because like sometimes I run into T-squares where like I'm personally like I don't really get that, like I don't understand how that energy gets resolved through that point and in that house. But to hear you explain it, and say, oh, like I've been going through all of these changes and processes that are very material, that are very time-oriented while contemplating my own career. And then kind of like, it sounds like you're kind of like doing this process of slow, emotionally moving through the outer process in order to transform the inner, which I think is a very sort of like Plutonian way to approach it in the sixth house, which makes sense in this context. And not just that, but where Saturn is right now is activating this T-square in particular as well. I think Saturn just started retrograding around 12 degrees a couple weeks ago. And so right now, like Saturn has been approaching your Pluto and your midheaven, which I'd say is the most important part, and starting to basically trigger all of those dynamics of that T-square. So one of the things that you can know about your chart and take away from this is that if you ever decide to start looking at transits and learn more about astrology, you can know that those three placements for you, your Jupiter, your midheaven, and your Pluto, are very tightly connected and are very important. And when you have a big planet transit them, like Jupiter or Saturn, Jupiter is every 12 years and Saturn is every 29, 30 years, you can basically expect for changes to happen or something of this process and this relationship within yourself to come up again. So thank you for giving us that impressionistic example, because like it helped me get it. I love that.
Another thing that what you just said sparked, that part of the like way that those two opposites are mixing for me is literally that like all of the outer flurry of struggles is making me just really emotionally raw, essentially. So I have no choice but to like work through the stuff that comes up. Like it's just not able to stay stuff down anymore because I don't have any of the psychic energy to not deal with it. So just like little things that people say, or if I have like a particularly difficult meditation or trance work session, the stuff that comes up has to be worked through. There's just like not another option.
Yeah.
And those things are inextricable from one another right
Yeah.
now, unfortunately.
And I love that you bring up that happens during those moments too, because like that's a very sixth house matter. It's very much about, you know, your daily rituals, the things that you kind of just like commit to, and it's very Virgoan, very sixth house, very I love it.
Yeah, it's also interesting to hear you talk about how these sudden kind of, or like overwhelming changes have been going on in your life in the past little while. I know around 2 weeks ago we had a solar eclipse in Gemini, and I've been learning that solar eclipses activate solar and lunar aspects of the chart, and so Cancer and Leo are houses that often can reflect the way that solar eclipses might affect us. And for your sun to be in Cancer, which is the sign ruled by the moon, and to have your Jupiter Mercury conjunction next door in Leo, which is ruled by the sun, I could see how a solar eclipse in a house nearby, especially, would have you kind of overwhelmed intellectually, having like a lot to think about, especially thinking and communicating in like ways or to institutions that you're not used to having to communicate yourself to, and also feeling like your emotions are like, I demand attention right now, even if you're used to kind of intellectualizing your way through overwhelming situations. I could see how like this solar eclipse was well positioned to create that kind of dynamic in your life over the past little while.
Well, now I'm angry at eclipses.
Yeah, you can join a club. There's a club. Awesome. Sad, is there anything else that really stands out about the chart that you...
Yeah. So I think I'd like to wrap up just by saying, just to look at this overall and sort of ask, you know, like, who are you as a person? You know, I think that's a good, nice way to encapsulate, or maybe not who you are, but who are you becoming? What is your identity process for yourself personally? And what I see here is somebody who is very sensitive, very hardworking, who's gone through a lot of experiences and is moving into a place increasingly where they're expressing their own truth and relating to that in a deeply spiritual way. But you also have these Mars and Venus in Virgo, which are very lovely because they ground and enable you to accomplish the work that you want to do, because they are very detail oriented, they're very pragmatic, they're very practical. You know, one of the key things of Mars and Virgo is that when you go about things, you have a plan. You sometimes even have like a grand master plan. That's kind of what a Mars Virgo will do sometimes. It just like gets away with wanting to, like, you know, nail down every single little thing. But it's not totally out of control here from what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, which is great. Mine is. So I don't know. Yeah, I like this chart a lot. I think that you have some key difficulties to go through, but you understand what they are and you understand how they exist within yourself in relation to the rest of yourself. And I think that's really important and really valuable. And one of the great things is that as we've kind of gone through this, you can also think about these dynamics within yourself through the lens of the astrology and the planets and the aspects between them, because you really can often see the correlation between like different parts of yourself, whether you choose to look at that from an IFS or more of a energetic point of view, that are interacting. You know, they feed into one another, and different things trigger different reactions, as we've described. Yeah, I don't know. I like it. Thank you for laying us in.
All right. Thanks for running me through some of that. Yeah, that was really helpful. Well, I should go start my day of contacting Serbian and Greek airports about transit regulations. So that should be fun.
Yeah. And in the pandemic, no less. That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a mess.
Yeah. Mercury retrograde is over at least, so it'll be a little bit better from here on out, hopefully.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming to AstroPilled Live. Thank you, Wilderless, for letting us look at your chart. Thank you, Maybe again, and thank you to everybody for listening. We can call AstroPilled 6 a wrap.